Welcome, friends. We're so glad you've chosen to study with us as we study concerning Jesus of Nazareth. He did live, and according to the Bible, he is the Son of God. Many dispute that. But we've been examining and trying to do so in an immortal way what the Bible has to say about him and about those things that do either indicate he was the Son of God or he was not. We realize today that when Jesus did come to this earth, that he took on himself the form of a servant, as Paul wrote, made in the likeness of man. He humbled himself, becoming obedient to death, the death of the cross. God then highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name. Two phrases that were frequently used of Jesus while he walked and he talked was Son of Man and Son of God. And as we look at these two qualities as they are capsuled in one individual, sometimes it would seem that these could not be in one individual. While we look and we see Jesus walking on the earth, it was therefore necessary that there be times in which his godness was manifested. And there is nothing that illustrates this more than the fact of Jesus' omniscience, of his knowledge of things that man could not know. One of my favorite texts in all the Bible is Psalms 139. It says, "O Jehovah, you searched me and known me. You know my downsittings and mine uprisings. You search out my paths and lie down. You're acquainted with all my ways. There's not a word in my tongue. But, Lord Jehovah, you know it all together. You beset me behind, before. You've laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It's high. I cannot attain unto it. Whither shall I flee from thy spirit? Whither shall I flee from thy presence? If I ascend into heaven, thou art there. If I grave a Sheol, behold, thou art there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there shall thy hand hold me, and thy right hand shall lead me. If I say, surely the darkness shall overwhelm me, and the light above me shall become dark, even the darkness hides not from thee. The day and night are both alike to thee." This shows the omniscience of Jehovah. And because God is omniscient and all-knowing, then Jesus also, although he took on himself the form of man and had the qualities of man and was man, yet he was also God. And there were times in which this omniscience of God, of his knowledge, took place. Let's consider a few. Let's think about the fact that early in his ministry that Philip went to search disciples that would come to Jesus as he. He had a dear friend named Nathanael, and he invited Nathanael, saying to Nathanael, "We found the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth." And Nathanael was skeptical. He said, "Can any good thing come out of Nazareth?" And Philip said, "Come and see." As Nathanael drew near to Jesus, Jesus, seeing him, said, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there's no guile." Nathanael was astonished. "How did you know me, Rabbi?" And Jesus said, "Nathanael, before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." And Nathanael said, "Rabbi, you are Messiah. You are the Son of God." When we look at this, we ponder, how could Jesus know this strange man of the things he did under a fig tree? But how could he know the quality of this man? On another instance, the Apostle Peter was approached by certain of those that were collectors of tax, and they asked Peter, "Does your teacher pay the shekel, the half shekel?" And Peter said, "Yes, he does." And the Lord knew what Peter had done and the answer he had given to the question he was asked. And he said, "Well, now, Peter, to whom And of whom do the individuals, the rulers, receive their tribute? From strangers or from the children? And they said, from strangers. Then Jesus said, well, the children are free, but we don't want to offend them. Now, Peter, you go and bait you a hook and cast it in the sea. And the first fish comes up, it's going to have a shekel in its mouth. And you take that and you pay half shekel for you and half shekel for me. And Jesus knew that. Well, he did because he was God. As we look, one time there was an individual came into the synagogue, a woman. She was so stooped over she could not straighten herself up. Controversy arose when Jesus was designed and intended to heal her because it was the Sabbath. Jesus said, well, you lead your ox and your animals out to water, and ought not this woman who had been bound by Satan 18 years, ought not she to be loosed from the infirmity that Satan has imposed upon her? Now, how did Jesus know that? How did he know how long this woman had been sick? This was the first time that they had met. Think of another. We not only of this, but we think of Jesus and his disciples as they were in Jerusalem. And they were watching at the temple as different individuals cast their gifts into the treasury. And there was a woman that came, nondescript. And Jesus pointed her out to the disciples and said, do you see that woman? She's a widow. And she's given 2 mites. And what she gave is more than all the others gave because she gave everything that she had. Now, how did Jesus know that? She didn't have a sign or said, I'm a widow and I'm fixing to give all I've got, 2 mites. No, Jesus knew that because of his supernatural knowledge, of the knowledge that he knew of this woman's character, because he is God. Jesus met a woman on the way from Judea back to Galilee, in the city of Samaria, or in the country of Samaria. And he engaged her in conversation, asked of her a drink of water. And as it went on, and she was curious why that he, a Jew, would ask her, a Samaritan, water, Jesus engaged her in conversation and talked about the fact that he had living water. And she'd ask, well, she could have received it and never been one that would have thirsted again. She wanted that water. She said, give me that water. And Jesus said, okay, go call your husband. And she said, I don't have a husband. And Jesus said, that's right, you don't. But you've had 5, and you're living with a man right now. That's not your husband. How did Jesus know that? Jesus knew that because he's God. He has the knowledge of things of that sort. As we look, as Jesus was preparing for the last week of his sojourn upon this earth, we find that Jesus said to 2 of his disciples, go over in that village that is opposite to us. And when you get over there, you're going to find an ass and her colt tied. You loose her and you bring them to me. And if anyone is standing there that shall ask, why are you doing this? Just simply say, the Lord has need of them, and they'll let you bring them. And how did Jesus know that? The disciples did just like Jesus told them to do. They went into that village, and lo and behold, there was an ass and her colt. And as they loosed it, one standing by said, what are you doing, loosing the colt? And the disciple said, the master has need of them. And the owner said, take her. How did Jesus know that? He did that because he's God. As we look, we find that Jesus was one that was going into the city of Jericho. And as he was passing through that city of Jericho, there was a little man by the name of Zacchaeus that had heard about Jesus, and he heard Jesus was coming that way. But he was small, and the others were tall. He couldn't see him, so he ran on ahead of where the company was traveling to and climbed up in a sycamore tree. And the master came. And he said, Zacchaeus, come down from there. I'm going to eat with you today. Now, how did Jesus know Zacchaeus' name? He knew, because he's God. As we look, we find that Jesus heard the disciples as they came up behind him, and he knew they had been quarreling. He knew they'd been quarreling about who was the greatest of them. How did Jesus know that? Because he's God. When Jesus was one that was preparing the disciples for the inevitable fact he was going to be crucified, betrayed, he said, one of you is betraying me. But you know what? Jesus knew who that was. He knew that Judas was going to betray him. Not only did he know Judas was going to betray him, he knew that Judas was going to betray him for 30 pieces of silver. And how did he know that? Because he's God. And we find that Jesus talked with his disciples and warned them, every one of you are going to flee from me this night. And Peter said, not me, Lord. I'm not going to deny you. I'm going to stand and defend you. Everybody else may leave. I'm not. And Jesus said, Peter, before the cock crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. And it happened just exactly like Jesus said. How did Jesus know that? He knew that because he's God. Jesus knew he was going to be crucified. And he not only knew he'd be crucified, he knew he would be in the tomb 3 days. And he knew that after the 3rd day in the tomb, he would be one that came out of that tomb. And it happened just exactly like Jesus said. How did he know that? He knew that because, my friend, he's God. Not only did Jesus know the events of things that happened to individuals, Jesus knew what men were thinking. We find that one time Jesus was teaching in a certain city, and there were those that were believers in him. They had a friend that was palsied, and they brought him, 4 of them, and they brought him to the master. And when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the man, son, your sins are forgiven you. And Jesus knew something. They didn't say anything, but all of those that were the teachers said, this man's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? So Jesus said, let me ask you a question to these individuals. He said, which is easier to say, your sins be forgiven you, or arise, take up your bed and walk, but that you may know that the Son of Man hath power on earth to forgive sins. To the man that was sick with palsy, Jesus said, arise, take up your bed and walk. And he did so. Jesus knew what they were thinking. Another time, Jesus was eating in the house of a Pharisee by the name of Simon. And a woman came in from the street. She was an immoral woman, but she had learned about Jesus. And the sins that she had committed weighed down heavily on her. She came to Jesus and she anointed him with oil. And she wept. And she cried. And her tears fell on Jesus' feet. And Jesus' feet were dried with the hair of this woman. And now Simon, he knew who this woman was. Jesus didn't. But he knew who this woman was. And he thought, you know, if this man were a prophet, he would know what kind of a woman this is that's touched him, and he wouldn't allow that. So Jesus gave a parable that showed he knew exactly what Simon was thinking. He said, Simon, there was a man that had 2 debtors. One owed him 500 shillings, another owed him 50. He forgave them both. Which of the 2 do you think will love him the most? And Simon said, I suppose the one he forgave of 500, that owed him 500. He said, that's right, Simon. He said, Simon, when I came into your house, you didn't give me a greeting, but this woman had. And you didn't wash my feet, but this woman had. You didn't anoint me with oil, but this woman did. And Jesus said, her sins, which are many, are forgiven. There are many other instances, but time does not allow us to cite them all. These are those that show that Jesus was more than just a man. He knew the things that he could only know because he was God. Yes, he was a man, and he took on himself the limitations of man. He hungered, he thirsted, and he grew weary, he slept. But while he did all these things, he never ceased to be God. In our next lesson, we're going to be studying again this question, is Jesus of Nazareth the Son of God? And we're going to be looking at the fact that Jesus' miracles show the power of deity that resided in him. We thank you so much for having listened to us today, and we hope that you'll continue studying with us as we look at this so significant question to you, to me, is Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God. Thank you, my friends. May God bless you and your way.